In the spring of 1987, every farmer in Tama County, Iowa, planted corn on the same week in early May. Not because a committee had voted on it, not because the Extension Office had issued a mandate, because that was when you planted corn in Tama County. The soil hit 50 degrees, the calendar hit May, and the planters rolled. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember, and nobody saw any particular reason to question it. Let me tell you about what that looked like from the road, because you need to understand the weight of it before you can understand what one family decided to do differently. By the second week of May, every field you could see from the county road had been worked. The dark soil was turned and ridged, the rows running straight to the tree lines, and the air smelled like diesel and earth and the particular kind of optimism that only exists in planting season. Neighbors waved from their cabs. The co-op parking lot was full by 6 in the morning. The feed store had a line at the counter. This was Tama County doing what Tama County did, and it felt right the way gravity feels right. You don't argue with it, you don't question it, you just move with it or you get left behind. The Tesdall family had farmed the same 480 acres in Tama County for 4 generations. Arvid Tesdall had broken that ground in 1901, coming west from a farm outside Decorah with a team of horses and a second-hand walking plow, and the particular stubbornness that Scandinavian immigrants brought to the Iowa prairie like it was cargo they couldn't afford to leave behind. His son, Gunnar, had weathered the depression on that land, planting through years when the price of corn barely covered the seed. Gunnar's son, Harold, had expanded the operation to its current size in the 1960s, adding the North Quarter and the Creek Bottom acres that flooded every third year, but grew the best corn in the county in the years they didn't. And Harold's son, Niels, had taken over in 1978, the year interest rates started their long climb toward disaster, and had managed to hold the farm through the crisis years of the mid-1980s by being careful and quiet, and absolutely unwilling to gamble on anything he didn't understand completely. Niels Tesdall planted corn in early May. His father had planted corn in early May. His grandfather had planted corn in early May. The farm averaged 142 bushels per acre in a good year, 118 in a poor one, and Niels could tell you what those numbers meant in terms of the mortgage payment and the equipment loan and the property tax and the cost of inputs, because he had been running those numbers in his head since he was old enough to understand what they meant. He was not a man who took risks. He was a man who survived by understanding exactly how thin the margin was and never stepping over it. His daughter, Greta, was 17 years old in the spring of 1987, and she was nothing like him, and she was everything like him, and he didn't fully understand either of those things yet. Let me tell you about Greta Tesdall, because she is the reason this story exists, and you need to understand her before you can understand what she did. Greta was the kind of girl who noticed things that other people walked past. Not in a dreamy, distracted way, in a precise, cataloging way, the way a scientist notices things, the way an engineer notices things. She had her mother's eyes, which were the kind of pale blue-gray that looks like lake ice in February, and she had her grandfather Harold's habit of going very still and very quiet when she was thinking hard about something, which her teachers sometimes mistook for inattention, and which was, in fact, the opposite of inattention. She had been the top student in her class at the Tama County Consolidated School since the 4th grade, not by trying harder than everyone else, but by being unable to stop thinking about things once she started. She had taken every science class the school offered by the time she was a junior, and when she ran out of science classes, she had written a letter to the extension office at Iowa State University asking if there were materials she could study independently, and a professor named Dr. Elaine Voss had written back, which was the beginning of something Greta's father did not yet know about. But before any of that, there was the journal. Let me tell you about the journal, because it is the oldest piece of this story and the one that matters most. Harold Tesdall had kept a weather journal from 1951 until his death in 1983. It was a series of composition notebooks, 14 of them, filled with his small, cramped handwriting and blue ballpoint pen. Every day he had recorded the high temperature, the low temperature, the precipitation, the wind direction, the cloud cover, and his own observations about what the weather was doing to the land. He had noted first frost dates and last frost dates. He had noted the date the soil reached 50 degrees at 4-inch depth, which he measured with a thermometer he had ordered from a seed catalog in 1953 and kept in the barn on a nail above the workbench. He had noted planting dates and emergence dates, and the dates of late cold snaps that caught newly emerged seedlings, and what those cold snaps had cost him in replanting. He had noted dry spells and wet spells, and the years when a late June rain had saved a crop that looked finished, and the years when an early August drought had taken a crop that looked promising. 14 notebooks. 32 years of daily observation. When Harold died, the notebooks went into a cardboard box in the farmhouse attic. Niels knew they were there. He had looked at them once after the funeral and found them too full of his father's handwriting to spend much time with, and had put them back. They were not something he thought about. They were not something anyone thought about, until Greta was 14 years old and found them on a rainy Saturday afternoon when she was looking for something else entirely, and sat down on the attic floor in the gray October light and did not come down for dinner until her mother called her 3 times. She had read all 14 notebooks by the end of that winter. Let me tell you about what she found in them, because this is where the story turns from a family history into something else. Greta had read the notebooks the first time the way you read any story, beginning to end, absorbing the texture of her grandfather's voice and the rhythms of the farm through his eyes. But the second time she read them, she had a notebook of her own, and she was writing things down. She was looking for patterns. She was 17 years old, and she had been corresponding with Dr. Elaine Voss at Iowa State for 8 months, and Dr. Voss had given her a framework for thinking about growing degree days and soil temperature accumulation, and the relationship between planting date and yield. And now Greta was looking at 32 years of her grandfather's weather records and asking a question that nobody in Tama County had ever thought to ask, or at least had never thought to write down. The question was this: what actually happened in the years when Harold had planted late? Because Harold had planted late sometimes, not by choice usually. Wet springs that kept the equipment off the fields, equipment breakdowns that cost a week. A year in 1962 when a late cold snap had killed his first planting, and he had replanted in the last week of May. And in those years, Harold had noted the yields, and Greta had noticed something about those yields that made her go very still in the way that meant she was thinking hard. The late-planted corn had yielded better, not always, not dramatically, but consistently in years with dry Julys, which Tama County had with uncomfortable regularity. The corn planted in the last 2 weeks of May had out-yielded the corn planted in the first 2 weeks of May. Harold had noted this himself, in several places in his careful blue handwriting. He had written, in the summer of 1962, after the replanted corn came in at 158 bushels per acre against a county average of 131. Curious that the late corn did so well. Dry July again. The late corn seemed to have deeper roots by the time the dry spell hit. We'll think on this. He had thought on it. There were 3 more entries in subsequent years where he had noted the same pattern, but he had never changed his planting date. Because you planted corn in early May in Tama County. Because that was what you did. Greta brought her notebook down from the attic in February of 1987, and she sat down at the kitchen table after dinner, and she told her father what she had found. Niels Tesdal listened to his daughter the way he listened to most things, quietly, with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on the table. He was 51 years old and had been farming this ground for 9 years on his own and had survived the worst agricultural crisis in 50 years by being careful, and careful men do not change things that are working. Greta had spread her notebook on the table, and she had the 14 composition notebooks stacked beside it, and she walked him through the numbers with the precision of someone who had been over them many times and knew exactly where the argument was strongest. She told him about the growing degree day research from Iowa State. She told him about the work Dr. Voss had shared with her on soil temperature and root development. She told him that corn planted when the soil was at 50 degrees was not corn planted at optimal temperature, that the seed sat in cold soil for days before germinating, that the root system that developed in cold soil in the first 2 weeks of May was shallower and less branched than the root system that developed in warmer soil in the last 2 weeks of May. She told him that a shallower root system was a root system that ran out of moisture first in a dry July. She told him that Tama County had experienced a dry July in 11 of the 32 years her grandfather had recorded, and that in 9 of those 11 years, the late planted fields in Harold's records had outperformed the early planted fields by an average of 18 bushels per acre. The kitchen was quiet. Niels's wife, Britta, had stopped washing dishes. She was standing at the sink with a dish towel in her hands, listening. Niels set down his coffee cup. He looked at the notebooks. He looked at his daughter's notebook with her careful columns of numbers. He said, finally, that he needed to think about it. Greta said she thought they should plant 2 weeks later than everyone else. Not all 480 acres. Just the south quarter, the 120 acres of lighter soil that dried out fastest in a dry summer and had always been the field that underperformed worst in dry years. She said she thought the south quarter was the right place to test it because it was the field that had the most to gain. Niels said he needed to think about it. Britta Tesdal set down her dish towel and said, quietly, that she thought Greta was right. Niels looked at his wife. He looked at his daughter. He picked up his coffee cup and found it was empty and set it back down. He said he would think about it over the weekend. He thought about it for 3 weeks, which meant he was taking it seriously. Let me tell you about the science, because Greta had done the work and it deserves to be explained properly. The conventional wisdom on corn planting in Iowa in 1987 was built around 2 things: the last frost date and the soil temperature threshold. Corn seed needs soil temperatures of at least 50 degrees Fahrenheit at planting depth to germinate reliably, and in Tama County, that threshold was typically crossed in the first week of May, sometimes the last days of April. The Extension Service recommendation was to plant as soon as soil temperatures hit 50 degrees and field conditions allowed, because an earlier planted crop had more days to accumulate growing degree days before the first fall frost, and more growing degree days meant higher yields. This was the logic. It was not wrong exactly. It was incomplete. What the conventional wisdom did not fully account for was the relationship between planting date and root architecture. Corn planted in 50-degree soil germinates slowly. The seed sits in cold ground for 10 to 14 days before emergence, and during that time it is vulnerable to soil pathogens and cold injury, and the root system that develops in cold soil in those first critical weeks is different from the root system that develops in warmer soil. Dr. Voss's research, which she had shared with Greta in a series of letters that Greta had read and reread until the pages were soft at the folds, showed that corn planted when soil temperatures were at 55 to 60 degrees developed a more extensive nodal root system in the first 3 weeks after emergence. The nodal roots, which are the roots that do most of the water and nutrient uptake after the first month, were longer and more branched in the warmer soil plantings. They reached deeper into the soil profile. They found water that shallower roots could not reach. In a wet year, this difference was small. In a year with normal July rainfall, the difference was small. But in a dry July, when the top 18 inches of soil were losing moisture faster than rain could replace it, the difference between a root system that reached 22 inches and a root system that reached 30 inches was the difference between a crop that struggled and a crop that didn't. Greta had calculated, using her grandfather's weather records and the yield data he had kept alongside them, that the expected value of late planting on the south quarter over a 10-year period was positive by approximately $2,400 per year, accounting for the years it would cost her and the years it would gain. She had shown her father this calculation. She had shown him the underlying data. She had shown him Dr. Voss's research letters. He had thought about it for 3 weeks, and then he had come to breakfast on a Tuesday morning in March and said, without preamble, that she could plant the south quarter 2 weeks behind everyone else, but that he was planting the rest of the farm on schedule, and that if the south quarter came in below the rest of the farm, he expected her to be honest about it. Greta said she would be honest about it. She was 17 years old, and she had just been given 120 acres to prove something. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever tried to explain to a farming community why you are doing something differently? Not a small differently. Not a different seed variety or a different fertilizer rate. A different planting date, 2 weeks behind every other planter in the county, in a world where the planting calendar is as fixed as the church calendar and about as open to revision. Have you ever tried to explain that to the man at the co-op counter? Or to the neighbor who stops his truck on the county road to ask why your fields are still bare when everyone else's are already showing green? Because Greta Testdahl was about to find out what that felt like, and it did not feel good, and it did not feel fair, and it felt exactly like what it was, which was a 17-year-old girl with a notebook full of data standing in front of a wall of certainty that had been built over 4 generations and was not interested in being questioned. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand him before you can understand the particular flavor of what happened at the Tama County Co-op on a Saturday morning in May of 1987. Dale Crowley was 63 years old and had been the manager of the Tama County Farm Bureau Co-op for 22 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had spent 22 years being right about things. And being right about things for 22 years does something to a person. It makes certainty feel like wisdom, which is a reasonable mistake to make until it isn't. Dale knew every farm in the county and every farmer in the county, and he knew what they planted and when they planted it and what they got for it, and he had opinions about all of it, and those opinions were delivered from behind the co-op counter with the authority of a man who has never been seriously wrong about anything in his professional memory. He held court at the co-op counter the way a judge holds court in a courtroom, except with more coffee and more profanity, and a better audience. Farmers came in for seed and fertilizer and stayed for Dale's assessment of the season and each other's situations. It was a social institution as much as a commercial one. And on a Saturday morning in the second week of May, when every field in Tama County was planted and showing the first faint blush of green, except for the Tesdall South Quarter, which was still bare dark soil, Dale Crowley had opinions. Greta had come in with her father to pick up a part for the planter. She was standing at the counter, waiting while her father talked to the parts man in the back, and Dale Crowley was behind the counter with two other farmers Greta knew by name, Wes Harrington and Buck Donnelly, and they were talking about the Tesdall South Quarter because it was the most visible anomaly in the county, and anomalies were currency at the co-op counter. Dale said he'd heard Nils Tesdall was letting his daughter run an experiment out on the South Quarter. He said it with a particular kind of smile. The kind that is not unkind exactly, but that positions a thing being described as inherently amusing. He said he supposed everyone had to learn sometime. He said that the corn planted 2 weeks late was corn that was going to spend 2 weeks catching up, and that, in his experience, corn that spent time catching up was corn that never quite caught up, and that the South Quarter was going to come in short, and Nils Tesdall was going to have a conversation with his daughter about listening to people who knew the county. Wes Harrington laughed. Buck Donnelly looked at his coffee. Greta was standing 6 feet away, and Dale Crowley knew she was standing 6 feet away, and he said it anyway, which told you something about how much weight he gave to the possibility that he was wrong. Greta turned around. She was 17 years old, and she was wearing a Carhartt jacket 2 sizes too big for her that had been her father's, and her hair was in a braid, and she had her notebook in her hand because she had her notebook in her hand most of the time that spring. She said, without raising her voice, that she appreciated his concern, and that she had actually looked at the data on late planting in Tama County, going back to 1951, and that she was happy to share it with him if he was interested. Dale Crowley's smile stayed on his face, but it got smaller. He said that he'd been watching corn get planted in this county for 40 years, and he didn't think a notebook was going to tell him something he didn't already know. Greta said that her grandfather had kept 32 years of weather and yield records, and that in 11 dry Julys out of 32 years, the late planted fields had outperformed the early planted fields by an average of 18 bushels per acre, and that she had corroborating research from Iowa State on the root development mechanism that explained why, and that she would be glad to leave a copy of the data with him if he wanted to look at it. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale Crowley laughed. It was a short laugh, the kind that is meant to close a conversation rather than open one. He said that was real interesting and that he'd keep an eye on the South Quarter come August. He said it the way you say something to a child that you have no intention of following up on. Greta's father had come back from the parts counter in time to hear the last part of the exchange. He put his hand briefly on Greta's shoulder, not to restrain her but to acknowledge her, and he paid for the part, and they walked out to the truck. Driving home, Nils Tesdall did not say anything for a long time. Then he said that Dale Crowley had been wrong before, even if he didn't know it. Greta looked out the window at the fields going past, all of them green and planted and orderly, and she said she knew. She said she just needed the summer to prove it. The summer of 1987 was dry, not catastrophically dry, not 1988 dry, but dry in the particular Tama County way That meant the subsoil moisture was gone by the 1st of July and the rain gauge was showing half an inch a week when the corn needed 2, and the fields on the lighter soils were starting to show the dull gray-green color that meant stress. The early planted corn across the county was in the critical pollination period in the 2nd week of July, and the soil at 18 inches was dry, and the plants were drawing on reserves that were already thin. The Tesdall South Quarter was 2 weeks behind in its development, which meant it was not yet in pollination when the worst of the dry spell hit in mid-July. It was still in the vegetative stage, still building its canopy, still deepening its root system, and the roots it had built in the warmer June soil were exactly what Greta had said they would be. She had walked the field every 3 days through June and July, and she had a record in her notebook of the soil moisture at various depths, and the plant height, and the color of the leaves, and the development stage, and she'd compared it to the rest of the farm and to the neighbors' fields that she could see from the road, and what she saw matched what she had expected to see. The north field and the east field, planted in early May on schedule, were showing stress by the 3rd week of July. The leaves were rolling in the afternoon heat, which is what corn leaves do when the plant is trying to reduce water loss, which is what the plant does when it cannot pull water from the soil fast enough to replace what it loses through its leaves in the heat of the day. Nils Tesdall walked those fields, and he did not say anything, but his face said something. The South Quarter was not rolling. The South Quarter was dark green and standing straight in the afternoon heat, and it was not rolling. Nils walked the South Quarter on a Thursday afternoon in late July, and Greta walked it with him, and neither of them said much. The plants were at the right development stage for the date, slightly ahead of where the calendar said they should be because the June warmth had pushed accumulation faster than average, and they were healthy in a way that the early planted fields were not. Nils stopped in the middle of the field and looked at the plants around him, and then looked at the sky, and then looked at his daughter. He said, carefully, that it looked good. Greta said it did. He said he supposed they would know more at harvest. She said they would. He walked back to the truck without saying anything else. But he walked differently than he had walked into the field, and Greta noticed that. Let me tell you about the harvest, because the harvest is where the numbers stopped being theoretical and started being real. The Tesdall farm harvested in the order it always harvested: North Field first, then East, then the Creek Bottom Acres, and finally the South Quarter. The North Field came in at 127 bushels per acre. That was below its 5-year average of 138. The East Field came in at 121. The Creek Bottom Acres came in at 144, which was good for creek bottom ground in a dry year because the creek bottom held moisture that the upland fields didn't. Nils recorded all of this in the farm ledger without comment. He had been farming long enough to know that a dry year was a dry year and that 127 bushels was not a disaster. It was just a disappointing year. Then they harvested the South Quarter. The South Quarter came in at 156 bushels per acre. Nils Tesdall sat in the cab of the combine for a long moment after the last pass, looking at the yield monitor. He climbed down and walked to where Greta was standing at the field edge with her notebook, and he told her the number, and she wrote it down. She had the previous year's South Quarter numbers in the notebook for comparison. The South Quarter's 5-year average was 119 bushels per acre, because it was the lighter soil, the field that always underperformed. It had just come in at 156 in a dry year when the rest of the farm was running 20 bushels below average. The difference between the South Quarter's yield and its 5-year average was 37 bushels per acre. At $1.94 per bushel, which was the cash price that fall, that was $71.78 per acre above the field's average performance. On 120 acres, that was $8,613.60 in additional revenue in a single year from a single field because of a 2-week difference in planting date. Greta showed her father the calculation. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said quietly that she had been right. He said it simply, the way a careful man says something he has confirmed to his own satisfaction. He said he thought they should expand the late planting to the east field next year as well, which was the other light soil field that dried out in July. He said she should decide how they wanted to rotate it. She was 17 years old, and her father had just told her to decide the rotation. She said she thought they should keep the south quarter on the late schedule and add the east field, and that they should also look at whether the creek bottom acres might benefit from early planting more than the upland fields, since the creek bottom had the moisture reserves to support early planting in dry years. She said she had been thinking about that, and she had some numbers she wanted to show him. Neil Tesdahl looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who is realizing something he should have understood sooner. He said that sounded right. He said they could look at the numbers after dinner. Now, let me tell you about what happened at the co-op that fall, because it is a different kind of scene than the one in the spring, and the difference matters. Greta was not there for it. Neil's was. He had gone in for a fertilizer order in October, and Dale Crowley was behind the counter, and the South Quarter yield had made its way through the county the way numbers make their way through small farming communities, which is to say quickly and with some distortion, but essentially accurately. Dale Crowley asked Niels about the South Quarter yield. Niels told him the number. Dale was quiet for a moment and then said it had been a dry year, and that dry years were anomalies. Niels said that his daughter had data suggesting dry Julys occurred in about a third of years in Tama County going back to 1951, and that in those years the late planting showed a consistent advantage. Dale said that 1 year wasn't a pattern. Niels said that his daughter had 32 years of his father's records, and she was working on the 2nd year of her own. Dale said he supposed they'd see. His voice had lost some of its certainty. Not all of it, but some. Greta heard about this exchange from her mother, who had heard it from Niels, and she wrote it in her notebook under the harvest numbers with a single sentence: Year 1 complete. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story does not end with one harvest and one quiet acknowledgement from a careful man. The story continues the way real things continue, which is slowly and with setbacks and with the kind of accumulating evidence that cannot be dismissed 1 year at a time, but becomes impossible to argue with when you lay all the years side by side. In 1988, Greta Tesdahl was 18 years old and had been accepted to Iowa State University to study agronomy, which was the field Dr. Elaine Voss had been guiding her toward for 2 years. She deferred her enrollment for 1 year, which her parents did not fully understand, and Dr. Voss did understand completely, because Greta wanted to be on the farm for the 2nd year of the experiment. The east field had been added to the late planting rotation. The South Quarter was in its 2nd year on the late schedule. The rest of the farm was planted on the traditional early schedule. The summer of 1988 was not dry, it was wet, and the late planted fields came in below the early planted fields, as Greta had predicted they would in a wet year. The South Quarter yielded 138 bushels per acre. The North field yielded 161. Greta recorded all of this without distress, because this was exactly what the data said would happen in a wet year, and a wet year was not a refutation of the strategy. It was a confirmation of the model. She showed her father the numbers in the context of the expected value calculation she had done in the original proposal, and she showed him where 1988 fit in the model, and she showed him that even accounting for the wet year underperformance, the 2-year average on the South Quarter under the late planting system was still above the South Quarter's historical average. Niels looked at the numbers and said that he understood. He said it in a way that meant he actually understood, not in the way that means a person is waiting for you to finish talking. The summer of 1989 was dry again, not as dry as 1987, but dry enough. The South Quarter came in at 149 bushels per acre. The North Field came in at 131. The East Field, in its second year on the late schedule, came in at 143 against its 5-year average of 127. Greta was at Iowa State by then, home for the harvest, and she sat at the kitchen table with her father and her notebooks, and they went through the 3-year numbers together. The South Quarter's 3-year average under late planting was 148 bushels per acre. Its previous 5-year average had been 119. The improvement was not entirely attributable to planting date, because years differed in ways that couldn't be fully controlled, but the pattern was consistent with the mechanism Greta had described at the beginning, and the pattern was strong enough that Niels Tesdal said, over coffee, that he thought they should consider whether any of the upland acres should stay on the early schedule at all. Greta said she thought the creek bottom acres should stay early because the moisture profile was different there, and that the upland fields should all move to late planting. She said she had been working with Dr. Voss on a more formal analysis of the data, and that she wanted to present it to the county extension office when it was ready. Niels said that sounded right. He said he thought her grandfather would have been interested to see this. Greta said she thought so too. She said Harold had noticed the pattern himself in the notebooks, but hadn't had the framework to act on it. Niels was quiet for a moment and then said that sometimes you see something, but you don't have the language for it yet, and that Greta had given the pattern a language. Greta looked at her father across the kitchen table and did not say anything, because some things don't need to be said. Let me tell you about the summer of 1991, because that is the year the argument ended. Not quietly, not gradually, but decisively, in the way that a long argument ends when the evidence becomes impossible to reframe. The summer of 1991 was the driest summer in Tama County since 1956, which was before Harold Tesdal's records began, but not before the county's collective memory. The rain gauge at the Tesdal farm showed 1.2 inches for the entire month of July, against a 30-year average of 3.8 inches. The corn across the county was in pollination in the second week of July, which was exactly when the worst of the drought hit, and pollination failure in corn is not a partial problem. Pollination failure means empty cobs. Empty cobs mean no yield. The Tesdal upland fields, all of them now on the late planting schedule, were not yet in pollination in the second week of July. They were in the late vegetative stage, 2 weeks behind the county, their root systems reaching into the subsoil moisture that the early planted corn had already exhausted. When the county's corn was failing to pollinate in 110-degree heat with no rain, the Tesdal corn was still building its canopy and had not yet reached the stage where drought could do its worst damage. The county average yield in 1991 was 87 bushels per acre. That was the worst county average since 1956. Farms with light upland soils came in lower. Wes Harrington's farm, which bordered the Tesdal North Field, came in at 74 bushels per acre on his upland ground. Buck Donnelly's farm came in at 79. There were Farms in the county that came in below 60 bushels per acre on their worst ground, and at $2.25 per bushel, that was not enough to cover inputs. And there were families in Tama County in the fall of 1991 who were having very serious conversations about the future. The Tesdall upland fields came in at 124 bushels per acre. On the worst drought year in 35 years, in a county averaging 87 bushels per acre, the Tesdall upland fields came in at 124. The South Quarter, which had been the underperformer, the field that always ran 20 bushels below the farm average, came in at 131. The Creek Bottom acres, still on early planting, came in at 108, which was excellent for creek bottom ground in a drought year, and confirmed that the early planting was the right call for that field. Greta was 21 years old and finishing her junior year at Iowa State when the harvest numbers came in. Her father called her with the numbers, and she was quiet on the phone for a moment. And then she said she wanted to come home for a weekend before the end of the semester to go through the full analysis. Niels said she should come home. He said he thought there were some people in the county who might want to hear what she had to say. He said it simply, without drama, but it was the most significant thing he had said to her in 4 years of farming together, because Niels Tesdall did not suggest that people wanted to hear things unless he was certain they did. Let me tell you about what happened at the Tama County Extension Office meeting in November of 1991, because it is the scene that the rest of the story turns on, and it deserves to be told carefully. Greta Tesdall drove home from Ames on a Friday afternoon and spent Saturday morning at the kitchen table going through 5 years of data with her father. And on Monday evening, she stood up in front of 43 farmers at the Tama County Extension Office meeting and presented what she had found. She was 21 years old, and she was wearing a Carhartt jacket, not the oversized one from her father's closet, but her own. And she had her notebooks, and she had a series of charts she had made with Dr. Voss's help, and she spoke for 45 minutes about planting date and root architecture and growing degree day accumulation, and the relationship between soil temperature at planting and nodal root development, and she showed the 5-year data from the Tesdall farm, and she showed the 1991 yield comparison against the county average, and she showed the expected value calculation that demonstrated the strategy was positive across all year types when weighted by historical frequency. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are not usually quiet when a 21-year-old woman is explaining to a room full of farmers that they have been planting their corn at the wrong time. Dale Crowley was in the third row. He had come because he came to every extension meeting, because that was part of his role in the county, and he had sat through the presentation with his arms crossed and his face doing the careful work of not showing what it was thinking. When Greta finished, there was a period of questions, and most of the questions were genuine and engaged, the kind of questions that people ask when they are seriously considering whether to change something they have always done. Wes Harrington asked about the wet year performance, and Greta showed him the 1988 numbers and the expected value weighting. Buck Donnelly asked about the logistics of running 2 planting schedules on the same farm, and Greta walked him through how the Tesdall operation managed it. A younger farmer named Jonah Rasmussen, who had taken over his family's farm 2 years earlier, and was the kind of person who asked questions without worrying about what the asking reveals, asked whether the root architecture research had been replicated at other universities. And Greta told him about the Iowa State trials and the University of Illinois work that Dr. Voss had referenced, and she offered to share the citations. Dale Crowley did not ask a question during the question period. He waited until the meeting was breaking up, until people were pulling on their coats and talking to each other in the low, energized way that people talk when they have just heard something that is rearranging their thinking. He came to the front of the room, where Greta was gathering her notebooks, and he stood there for a moment, and then he said that the 1991 numbers were hard to argue with. Greta looked at him. She said that she appreciated him saying so. He said he supposed the late planting had worked out for her family. He said it carefully, the way a man says something he is not fully prepared to say, with the hedges still in place. Greta said that she thought it would work for most of the upland farms in the county, particularly the ones with lighter soils, and that she had a copy of the full data set and the research citations if he wanted them. She held out a manila folder. He took it. He looked at it without opening it. He said he'd take a look. Then he said, and he said it quietly, almost to himself, that he told her father she was going to spend the summer catching up. He said it the way a person says something when they are acknowledging that they were wrong without quite being able to use the word wrong. Greta said she remembered. She said she appreciated that he'd kept an eye on the South Quarter, like he'd said he would. Dale Crowley looked at her for a moment, and then he did something that Greta had not expected. He smiled. Not the small closing smile from the co-op counter 4 years earlier, but a different kind of smile, the kind that cost something. He said that she'd done good work. He said it plainly, without qualification. Greta said thank you. She said she'd had good material to work with, that her grandfather had done 32 years of observation that made the whole thing possible. She said that Harold had noticed the pattern himself in the notebooks, but hadn't had the framework to act on it. Dale said he hadn't known Harold kept records like that. Greta said most people hadn't. She said she thought that was part of the point. Let me tell you about the years after, because the story of a good idea in a small farming community is not the story of a single dramatic conversion. It is the story of slow adoption and quiet conversations, and the gradual normalization of something that was once considered eccentric, until the thing that was once eccentric becomes the new common practice, and people forget that it was ever controversial. By the spring of 1993, 11 farms in Tama County were running late planting schedules on their upland fields. By 1995, it was closer to 30. Jonah Rasmussen had been one of the first adopters after the extension meeting, and his 1992 yield data, which he shared at the following year's extension meeting, provided a second data set that was independent of the Tesdall farm and confirmed the pattern. By the mid-1990s, the Tama County Extension Office had incorporated late planting recommendations for light upland soils into its official guidance, citing the Tesdall farm data and the Iowa State research, and a version of Greta's analysis had been published in the Iowa State Extension Service newsletter under her name and Dr. Voss's. Dale Crowley retired from the co-op in 1996. At his retirement party, which was held at the Tama County Fairgrounds and attended by most of the farming community, Niels Tesdall gave a short toast. He said that Dale had been the kind of person who kept the community together, who knew everyone's situation and helped people think through hard decisions, and that the county was lucky to have had him. He said it sincerely. He meant it sincerely. Dale Crowley had been wrong about one important thing, but he'd been right about a great many others over 22 years, and the community knew the difference. Greta was at the retirement party. She was 26 years old and had finished her degree at Iowa State and was working with Dr. Voss on a graduate research project on soil moisture and root architecture that had grown directly out of the Tesdall farm data. She shook Dale Crowley's hand at the party, and he held her hand for a moment and said that he'd been following the extension newsletter work and that it was good research. She said she appreciated that. He said he supposed her grandfather's notebooks had turned out to be worth keeping. She said she thought so. He said, and she would remember this, that he thought Harold would have been proud of her. She said she thought Harold had known the answer. He'd just needed someone to ask the right question. Dale said that was probably true of a lot of things. Let me tell you about the notebooks, because they are still there and that matters. The 14 composition notebooks that Harold Tesdall kept from 1951 to 1983 are in the farmhouse in Tama County. Not in the attic anymore, but in the bookcase in the living room, next to Greta's own notebooks, which now number 11 and cover the years from 1987 to the present. The notebooks are not museum pieces. They are working documents. Greta's younger brother, Soren, who took over the farm from Niels in 2004, consults them the way you consult any reliable record, as a source of information about what the land has done and what it is likely to do. The data in Harold's notebooks has been digitized, at Greta's insistence, and the digital version is archived at Iowa State, where it has been used in 3 published research papers on historical climate patterns and planting date optimization in the upper Midwest. Niels Tesdall died in 2011 at the age of 75, and the obituary in the Tama County paper mentioned the farm and the family and the 4 generations of stewardship, and it also mentioned, in a paragraph that Greta had written and Soren had approved, the late planting research and the extension service work, and the 32 years of weather records that had made it possible. The obituary said that Niels had been a man who listened when listening was hard, and that the farm was better for it. Greta spoke at the funeral. She talked about the Tuesday night in February of 1987 when she had spread her notebook on the kitchen table and her father had listened. And she said that the willingness to listen had been the thing, that the data had been there for 32 years in the attic, and the science had been available from Iowa State, and the pattern had been visible to anyone who looked for it. But that none of it had mattered until someone was willing to sit across a kitchen table and hear something they had never heard before and take it seriously. She said she had spent her career trying to be the kind of scientist who made it easy for farmers to take new information seriously, and that she had learned how to do that from watching her father do it. There was not a dry eye in the Tama County Lutheran Church that morning. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has a forward echo that is still unfolding and it would be wrong to leave it out. Greta Tesdall Johansson, as she is now, teaches agronomy at Iowa State University, where she holds the Harold Tesdall Chair in Soil Science, which was endowed in 2008 by a group of Tama County farmers who wanted to honor the man whose notebooks had started everything. She is 54 years old, and she still comes home to the farm several times a year, and she still walks the South Quarter when she comes, and she still carries a notebook. Her daughter Elsa is 19 years old and is in her first year at Iowa State studying environmental science, and last Thanksgiving, at the kitchen table in the Tama County farmhouse, where 4 generations of Tesdalls had made decisions about the land, Elsa put a notebook on the table and told her mother that she had been reading about cover cropping and soil carbon sequestration, and that she thought the Tesdall farm should consider a winter rye cover crop on the upland fields, that the research showed it would improve soil structure and water infiltration and reduce erosion, and that over a 10-year period the expected value was positive, even accounting for the seed cost and the management complexity. She had a folder of research citations, she had a data table, she had a calculation. Greta Tesdall looked at her daughter across the kitchen table. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the folder. She thought about a Tuesday night in February of 1987, about a girl with a notebook sitting across from a careful man who needed to think about it, and about what it had meant that he had thought about it and then said yes. She said, without pausing, that it sounded right. She said they should start with the South Quarter. Elsa looked at her mother. She said, "Are you sure? Just like that?" Greta said yes. She said she'd been waiting for someone to ask the right question about the South Quarter for a while now, and that the right question had a way of arriving when it was ready. She picked up the folder of research citations and started reading. Soren Tesdall, who was sitting at the other end of the table, looked at his sister and his niece and said nothing. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked out the window at the South Quarter, dark and fallow in the November light, and he thought about his grandfather walking that field in the summer of 1962, and writing in his notebook that the late corn had done well and that he would think on it. He thought about his father sitting at this same table in the winter of 1987, listening. He thought about 32 years of daily weather records in a cardboard box in the attic, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The South Quarter was out there in the dark, the same 120 acres it had always been, the same light soil over the same subsoil, the same field that had always underperformed until someone looked at it differently. It had been a problem, and then it had been a proof, and then it had been a lesson, and now it was going to be something else again. Because that is what good land does when good people pay attention to it. It becomes the next question. Harold Tesdall had noticed something in 1962 and written it down and not known what to do with it. His granddaughter had found it 25 years later and asked the right question. Her daughter was asking the next question now. Some knowledge doesn't disappear when the person who holds it dies. It waits. It sits in a cardboard box in an attic in a composition notebook in blue ballpoint pen, and it waits for the person who will know what to do with it. Harold planted late one year and wrote it down. The notebook sat in the attic for 4 years. A girl found it on a rainy Saturday and read it until dinner and then read it again. She took the numbers to a kitchen table and a careful man listened. The South Quarter came in at 156. The drought year came. The county averaged 87. The Tesdall upland fields came in at 124. And now a girl with a folder of research citations is sitting at the same kitchen table, asking the next question, and her mother is already reading. That's what happens when a family learns to listen to the person at the table who has done the work. The knowledge doesn't stop. It doesn't retire. It doesn't get put back in the attic. It just keeps going, generation to generation, question to question, notebook to notebook, each one building on the one before it, each one asking what the last one couldn't quite see yet. The South Quarter is still there. The notebooks are still there. And somebody is always asking the next question.